Alright, so for today's episode I'm going to be discussing the mule deer diets in southwest Nevada. Alright, so this part of southwest Nevada that I'm going to be covering is a lower density mule deer zone. I'm going to be covering hunting units 205, 207, 208, and then 11 through 13. These units are actually more of generally thought of as bighorn sheep units than mule deer units. These are some of the major bighorn sheep hunting units in Nevada. Nevada has the highest population of bighorn sheep out of any state in the lower 48. Most of them are desert bighorn, and a lot of them live in these units. So these are generally more of desert bighorn sheep hunting units than mule deer units, but mule deer do live there as well. Major towns in this area, there's not going to be a whole lot, but on the Highway 95 going south from Reno to Vegas, the main town that you'll encounter would be Tonopah, about 2,000 people, but other small mining towns such as Gabbs are found there. It's a relatively hot area, but since the elevations can be high here, it does see cooler temperatures. By November 1st, the average highs will be in the upper 50s to lower 60s. Average is seemingly around 59 degrees. This is a very, very arid area. This is going to be the most arid area that I'm going to cover because, to my knowledge, this is the most arid area that mule deer really live. This is kind of just east of Death Valley. Since mule deer don't live in Death Valley, this is pretty much adjacent to what you would expect from an area like Death Valley, getting really hot in the summer and being incredibly arid because it's in that rain shadow of the Sierra Nevadas. The deer population here is down like it is across all of Nevada. Nevada is now at around an estimated 70,000 deer, down from around up to 100,000 even 20 years ago, I want to say, is when it was up to at that level. But this area is trending down along with the rest of Nevada since the peak in the 1980s, and the population estimate for the herd here is incredibly low, below 1,000 deer for all of these units combined. I think it's right now at around probably 750 to 800 deer total in these herds, and the total harvest for these zones is pretty ridiculously low, but the advantage is since units like 205, 207, and 208 are paired with, I think, other units like 204 and 202. 204 and 202 take up most of the hunting pressure, and the harvest there could be up to 30, 40 deer in each of those zones, but 05, 07, and 08 are incredibly low. They're always in the single digits. The highest harvest for any of those zones was in 2014 when 8 mule deer were harvested from 205. And in 11, 12, and 13, those are always in the low double digits. The highest for those would have been 22 mule deer harvested in 2016 from Unit 212. So, ironically, the mule deer harvest is sometimes lower than the bighorn sheep harvest in some of these zones, but that's just a reflection of how arid it is in these zones. And due to that aridity, you kind of see a unique plant community in these zones, and that's why I wanted to cover it, because even though in these particular zones this plant community is going to be pretty characteristic, you'll end up seeing a lot of these plants in other zones, especially stuff like winter fat. That's going to be important in areas all across the West, including Wyoming and Montana, which I'll cover later on. But then Shadscale saltbush also shows up in areas like New Mexico and even Colorado. So that can be another important one. And I felt like since this area is characteristic of stuff like Greasewood and saltbush, it'd be a good way to introduce these more distinctly desert species rather than being like the mountain brush species such as the antelope bitterbrush and big sagebrush that I've already covered before. But a lot of the shrubby species in this area are going to be small, low-growing, spiny plants. And what you'll see a lot of in this zone too is cheatgrass now, that invasive annual grass from Central Asia that's taken over a lot of areas and causes a lot more fires to burn during the summer because it supplies that fuel load, and that ends up actually really messing with the shrub component and causing more frequent burning. That's a whole different rabbit hole. The first plant that I'm going to cover that mule deer utilize is Bailey's Greasewood. And up until I had been doing research on this, I actually didn't know that mule deer were utilizing it. It's a really common plant across most of the really dry valleys in western Nevada. You'll see it covering hundreds of miles there, along with the Shadscale saltbush. But like all the plants I'm going to cover today, it has these spines on it. The spines and the leaves are going to be some of the distinct characteristics separating it from other things. If you look at the leaves, they're these kind of weird, long and thick succulent type leaves. You won't confuse them for a whole lot else out there, but that's going to be your distinctive characteristic of Greasewood. And additionally, they have this weird sort of flower petal fruit thing where the fruit is flattened out and then there's one of those succulent leaves coming through the center of it. So that's another way you can tell that one. USDA, the plants database, rates the palatability for browsing animals as fair for this, and I think they have palatability can be high, good, fair, and poor, so it's kind of, it is palatable for them, but it's not as palatable as something like antelope bitterbrush or the snowberry that I've covered in previous episodes. It gets, this is probably the tallest out of the true desert valley plants you'll see out there, getting up to 3 feet tall, and those leaves will be just under an inch. If you go on the NRCS's website, the ecological descriptions for these areas where it kind of spells out how browsing animals like mule deer are using this plant community, they rate it as an important winter browse item for mule deer, in quotes. So, based on whatever research the NRCS has done, this is something mule deer view as important in these incredibly arid mountain slopes and valleys in western Nevada. Next one we're going to talk about is bud sage. So this is going to be one of those Artemisia sagebrush type plants, although it doesn't really look like the rest of them because it's really tiny, and during the summer it gets dry and it desiccates and it loses that really dark sagey color that's characteristic of sagebrush. But when it's growing, it has this normal sagebrush color. Like all the other plants I'm going to cover today, it has these spines, which kind of indicate that it is being browsed by something, because if it wasn't palatable to stuff like mule deer or jackrabbits, then it wouldn't need the spines. But it has spines like everything else. Rated by the USDA plants database as having medium palatability. So this is one of the more focal plants that can be browsed by mule deer in these really dry zones. And this makes up kind of the smallest of those shrubs in the valley component. So you'll see Greasewood being the really tall one, Shadscale is medium height, and then this bud sage will be down really low to the ground in between where the Greasewood and Shadscale is growing. Most of the time I've seen it, it's under a foot tall, and the leaves on this are really, really small. But they kind of cluster together to form buds, which is where it gets its name and makes it kind of distinctive from the rest of the sagebrush species, along with its spines. NRCS Ecological Site Description rates it as regularly used by mule deer in the area. The last one I want to cover today is actually one of my favorite plants. I find it interesting because it can actually grow in areas just where other plants can't grow due to constraints with precipitation. If you look at the U.S. Forest Service's website where they do their fire effects information system and they do their individual species profiles, they claim that this plant can grow in areas where they receive as little as 2 inches of precipitation a year. So you'll see this in areas where it's kind of cohabitating with stuff like cactus and the really true desert plants. Shadscale is truly capable of being a desert plant. You won't even find it in areas that get more than 10 inches of precipitation in a year. But it's one of the saltbush plants, so it is palatable to all browsing animals. And if it weren't for the spines, cattle can even browse on the Shadscale. It's that sort of type of palatability where pretty much any kind of animal finds it palatable, which is why it grows these really long spines that you can see on the bush there to prevent it from being over-browsed. But if you look at the Forest Service information site in areas where there's really high browsing pressure by something like domestic goat herds, this will actually decrease under pressure because it's so palatable to them. And usually a good rule of thumb is what's palatable for goats is generally palatable for mule deer. But it's in the chenopod family, along with the Bailey's greasewood that I talked about earlier, and a lot of the desert brush species that aren't within the sage family are going to be chenopods. You see a lot of chenopods in the outback in Australia as well. But this gets to about 2 feet tall. It wouldn't be unreasonable to see one that's 3 feet tall, but on average it's about 1 to 2 feet tall. leaves are 1/2 inch. You can tell this from the other types of saltbush mainly by the spines on it and the shape of the leaves. The leaves are more rounded instead of being long. And the other way too is it has these kind of dense, short clusters of leaves that you see sometimes extending beyond the spine. So in the picture on the right there, you can see how the leaves are clustered together on the end of the branches, and they kind of extend in a row going up from the end of the branch like that. So when you see it from a distance and there are these not quite sage-colored leaves and they're in clusters coming up from the plant, that's usually a good indication that you're driving through a field of Shadscale saltbush. But NRCS, their ecological site description for the area, lists this as being valuable spring browse for the mule deer in that area. So most of the information that I actually used on this one was from that NRCS ecological site description and whatever research they've done, and then from the individual species profiles on like the USDA plants database and the Forest Service fire information booklets, because there's not a whole lot of primary scholarly research done on what mule deer are browsing in these zones, because these herds are so small that there's not a lot of research focus on these areas and the utilization of mule deer on these browse items, so you won't find a lot of published research on it. So I had to kind of go through different government publications for this one. But these are some of the 3 main species that you'd find there on the particularly dry mountain ranges, probably below 8,000 feet in this western part of Nevada. Once you get above like 8,000 feet, you'll start to see big sagebrush again, and then they'll start utilizing that. But in the really dry, kind of lower elevation mountains in western Nevada, these are what I would say would be the 3 main components making up the browsing community there. Like I said, sources for this one, mainly that USDA plants database, the ecological site descriptions from the NRCS, and this other one, the U.S. Forest Service Fire Effects Information System, has individual species descriptions. It mainly focuses on how these species respond to wildfire and what their growing interval is and that sort of thing, but it also has a lot of good palatability information and a lot of their growth pattern information like that too. So that's a good resource if you're looking at individual plant palatability. And then I have the other booklet resource that I use, the Foods of the Rocky Mountain Mule Deer, and that mentions the utilization of Shadscale by mule deer in areas like western Nevada where it's particularly arid. And they're selecting it over sagebrush because that particular strain of sagebrush might not be as palatable, or it's just arid enough where in that particular zone Shadscale ends up dominating the sagebrush, because the sagebrush can't compete with Shadscale in areas that are receiving usually less than 6 inches of that liquid precipitation every year. Alright, thanks for tuning in, and I think next week or sometime soon I'll probably try to cover the Arizona Strip and transition back into an area that has a higher density of mule deer. I just wanted to get a kind of different one under the belt and cover something different in more of a true desert ecosystem, so I can introduce more plants into the kind of presentations that I've been doing. But thank you for tuning in.